Trove's combat and how you build classes can be broken up into 3 categories. Speed farming, where you're trying to complete dungeons as fast as possible, which means you need to have a class that has a good base movement speed and you will be sacrificing damage for more speed. Delves, which is a combination of damage and health. In most cases, you need to be really tanky to be able to survive the long, drawn-out gauntlet. And Leviathans are all about damage. You don't need to survive if you can kill it before it kills you. The efficiency of a class can basically be broken down into these 3 categories. Some will be stronger than others in one area and weaker in another. Another video of mine that I would recommend is the classes cheat sheet. It's basically a visual graph that kind of shows where each character fits in the spectrum. At the end of it all, I would always recommend that you play the class that you enjoy, rather than picking something specifically because it's efficient. So assuming you've picked out your main, let's get started with the more detailed tutorial. The Dino Tamer. Yet another class that you don't really hear people talk about too much, but the people that do main it know how god tier it is. Most of all, it's got to do with the movement speed of this character, because your most optimal style of play is actually going to be having your ultimate ability up 24/7. And the Dino Tamer actually always had the damage and survivability because it's a class that doesn't use stamina, which means technically you can fight like this, just staying in the air and shooting down at enemies. So unless you're dealing with something ranged, well, you'll be able to slowly but surely kill it. I will say that the dino babies kind of suck. There's not really much reason to use them. The main thing that you're going to be doing is using your ult and using your net in your ult, because this is going to do heaps of damage. It's also going to snare enemies, which can be helpful in delves with your team. So subclass ability is going to just kind of be the same old options as any class. You could use the Bard because randomly you can get the Bard's song that gives you movement speed. It also has some crit damage, which is nice. Faye is an okay one, but you're not going to be using that flying speed, so the bomb itself doesn't really matter too much. The Lunar Lancer subclass ability is going to be okay. Unfortunately, that physical damage is going to waste, but lunacy mode is not. Knight subclass, that's probably not one you want to end up using, because you're only going to be using the Knight subclass ability to get that extra Flask capacity, because your ultimate ability does not actually count as mount movement speed. It scales off of player movement speed, which means that you are not seeing the secondary benefit of the Knight subclass ability. But for my money, as always, it's just going to be Solarian, because that's going to be extra light, and light is very important. As far as your gear stat priority, for normal dungeon farming and what have you, you would go for a combination of movement speed and attack speed. Thankfully, you don't need energy regen on this class. If you absolutely want to use this character in deep delves, fighting Leviathans and stuff, the only thing that you would do is instead swap your movement speed into crit damage while still keeping the attack speed, because that's going to give you more optimal, well, damage. But for my money, I would always stick with the movement speed, because that's where this class shines more so as a speed farmer than versus a boss killer. The Dino Tamer's various ring abilities are going to be Oh My Dinos, which Dino Buddy now spawns 2 minions instead of 1. However, this ability is still kind of useless because you're gonna be soft capped at 6 minions, if I recall. That's just how all of the minion classes work. Mr. Chomp Chomp, which is going to make your Dino Mount also spawn a T-Rex minion. And then there's going to be Deep Wounds, which applies a damage increase debuff to enemies dealt damage by Dino Tamer and their Dino summons. That Deep Wounds is not worth it for the buff. As far as Dino Tamer mains are concerned, you pretty much always want to focus on Mr. Chomp Chomp, just because that name is as hilarious as it is also quite powerful, surprisingly. So your best banner in slot is going to end up being the torches from Leviathans. Namely, there's going to end up being the Permatorch as the absolute best. Now, something that I haven't been doing in these videos, which in hindsight I probably should have done, is if you go to the Sunseeker's Crystal Forge, this is where you will end up crafting up your torches into the stronger variation, which this is a really good one for physical damage. This one's a really good one for magic. And in my opinion, this would be the best one to go for if you're a magic class. In particular, Dino Tamer because this is going to end up giving you damage, but also movement speed. And I don't even get me started on where you get most of these items because they're just mostly from the delves. The best allies in slot for Dino Tamer are going to be Orchian out of the Paragon tree because you'll get light, magic damage, and more importantly, a movement speed boost when a nearby enemy dies. So from the hub, you would go down here, and this is where you're going to be able to craft Orchian for these various resources. Namely, the most difficult one is going to be the Paragon marks, which you need to get from Prime Paragon Pinatas. Starry Skyfire out of the star chart, which is going to increase your cooldown recovery speed. And that again is very important. Nay, I would say even more important than the movement speed buff you get from Orchian, just because this way you'll be able to have your ultimate ability up more often. And that's kind of the most important thing to his kit. So from the hub, going all the way up here to the star chart, you're naturally going to end up having Starry Skyfire because it's in one of the light nodes anyways. And as we'll end up talking about when we talk about the skill tree, this is kind of a mandatory node. Lastly, if you just want raw damage and nothing but, you would go for the mini water mana beast because that extra magic damage and crit damage on this ally actually equates to more overall damage versus the extra light you get on the other allies. From the hub, going down into the basement over here is where you'll be able to find the Mystic Arts, and all the way down in the collectibles, this is going to be the mini water mana beast, which you can see I still haven't crafted yet. But yeah, that's just because it requires a lot of mana from a specific elemental world. So for the skill tree, these are the abilities that I would prioritize. There's the Life Leech node, which will pretty much make almost all of your classes invincible. Not entirely, but the Life Leech is very, very good in this game. The movement speed nodes are always important to me, and then you would go for the light nodes and the damage nodes. Of course, just rather than what I have for my skill tree, which is the physical damage build, you would end up going for the magic damage build. So just follow this chart that I have on screen. These are pretty much the best flasks in the game. I always just use Death Defying because I'm lazy, but frankly speaking, as the Dino Tamer, you can use the Elysian Bandolier if you need an ultimate burst of boss damage, but otherwise Conjurer's Crucible for when you're doing long farming stints, because this will end up triggering every time Magic Find triggers, and if your Magic Find is high enough, you can recover more flasks than you expend while you're hunting, which is why a lot of people usually like using it for farming. But for me, I always like using Death Defying just because the end game enemies will usually end up one-tapping you, and that's just not fun having to deal with that. As for your emblems, because we've got the long shade difficulty and so on, unfortunately, you're probably never going to be able to swap Arcane Emblem off. Of course, it does depend which area of the game you focus on, because if you're like me, you probably don't like the end game area very much and can go a couple difficulties down, which means you could swap to whatever you want. But for most of you, you're going to be using Arcane Emblem. For your secondary emblem, you could use Trailblazing, although it's not really recommended over Chromatic. That's going to be the big one because once again, you are going to try and stay in your ultimate ability as much as possible, which means movement speed from various other effects aren't going to matter as much as having your ultimate up. But earlier on in the game, when you don't have max crit hit, you would use Sure Strike Emblem. So the mid-game stat goal you should be focusing on with Dino Tamer would be somewhere around like 60 to 80,000 magic damage, getting your crit hit to roughly 60%. Anything higher than that is obviously good. And then having your crit damage percent at 800%. Again, that's just for like mid-tier. You would build up upon that, of course, trying to get 100% crit hit as soon as possible. Now, before we end up getting into all of the gems and so on and so forth, I gotta mention this in all of these videos, but your top priority before touching any of the end game stuff should be getting your class max level, because that'll end up unlocking all of the different gem slots, which then in turns gives you the biggest power boost. Also, these videos are not aimed at being the most coefficient, because each of the classes is very different in their own like stats that they end up having when you have them maxed out. And so coefficiency builds slightly vary for every single individual class. I will make a coefficiency guide at some point in the future. I'm planning to, but I want to get these videos done first. So I'm going to swap over to my Draco just because that's where I have my good magic gems. So we're going to bulk the cosmic gems in their own category that we'll talk about later. For your empowered gems, you want to have all three of them be 2 boosts or pearls into magic damage, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. That's really important to just have those boosts in everything but crit hit. And then for your lesser gems, not cosmic gems, but just your lesser colored gems, we're gonna have 3 of them the exact same. So 2 boost magic, 1 boost crit damage, no boost crit hit. And then the other 3, you're going to end up having 2 boost crit damage instead, and then 1 boost magic damage, no boost crit hit. Eventually, when you end up having 100% crit hit, you can start swapping crit hit off of your gems to get more max health, so you have a little bit more survivability, but it's not super important. And again, if you have like some variety of gems, like this one I have is 3 boost crit damage, that's totally fine. Now your cosmic gems are way easier because the small gems and the big boy gem are all going to have 3 boosts into light, no boosts into crit damage and magic damage. Now for the empowered gem abilities, you definitely want to have the class gem ability, which increases the duration of the ultimate ability, which again is going to be what makes your ult like so good. It also ends up making the summon dino mount increases attack speed of the ultimate ability, the acid spit projectile as well. It's just, yeah, you need to have this class gem because it's a speedy boy. I would also focus on trying to get pyro disc as a must because that's going to give you a lot more movement speed. And then you can kind of just pick the last gem to be whatever you want. You could go for Cubic Curtain just because it'll give you more survivability. Or in my opinion, I would say Explosive Epilogue is probably gonna be the best one just because that'll give you really good damage for crowds, and Dino Tamer kind of exceeds at handling crowds rather than single target. As for the Cosmic Gem, you do technically have 2 options. Vampirium will give you Life Leech, which you don't need, but it will give you movement speed, so it's up to you. But ideally you would get Berserk Battler because that's going to just slowly increase your light value as you're fighting enemies, and thus it gives you more damage overall. Now I often like ending these videos kind of talking a little bit more personal and candid with you guys. So first of all, I gotta apologize for how long it took me to make this video. If I'm being perfectly honest, when I got back from my trip from Mexico, things got really busy with me in terms of real life stuff, you know, because we're going to ultrasounds and doctor appointments and stuff like that, all the baby related stuff. But then more recently, I've been having some major issues with my computer. I kind of talked about it in our video, so I won't get into too much detail here, but essentially I had to replace an important part of my computer, and it's had some side effects. It's not that the part is like worse or anything. My computer is actually operating at a much higher capacity than it used to, but the issue is I'm just slowly having to retweak a lot of things that I didn't think I would need to tweak, like with recording settings, audio setup, live streaming, and it's just, it's an ongoing process that I'm slowly trying to refine, and hopefully we'll be able to get under control soon. With that said, I hope you enjoyed today's video. I'll do my best to not take nearly as long between the next class guides. We almost have them all done, almost. But I would appreciate if you would like the video, subscribe, notification bell, all that stuff. You can check the merch store if you want to. I'll still make a video that'll highlight that soon. But in any case, I love you guys, and I hope that you ended up finding this video helpful.